Alright YouTube, it's time for Occult Video 38 on ancestral closeness. It should be on the concept of ancestral spiritualism anyway, as a whole, not, everything about it, but there's not enough time in one video really to describe it all. Really, you can't get into the minutia of such a subject, for which quite a large amount of literature exists. There are folk traditions going back thousands of years from basically all human cultures up to the modern day. One video cannot do the entire topic justice, so I'll focus specifically mostly on the concept of ancestral closeness, which I think is something that people generally overlook. Within modern occultism, you have a great deal of focus upon rituals, drawing up sort of demonic signatures and raising demons or various prayers, white magic you would call it, sort of the ceremonial side of magic. You have very little of folk inclusion into a lot of this modern material. Some of the folk material goes into herbalism, which I've already written a book about. I'm planning to release another one in the future. But the other side of that is sort of the ancestral spirits. Now, a lot of people would think of like totems. Not totemic animals. That's a different subject. It's similar, but in some of the Mesoamerican lore and so forth, you have these elaborate carved sort of totem poles of various materials that depict animal spirits, the bear, the wolf, or whatever. A tribe might have sort of a patron animal of sorts. Individuals will perform various rituals and rites in order to find out what specific animal their totem is. Claude Gagnon's work has a section on this. There are several tribes that make use of aquatic environments actually to perform this. They will essentially jump into the water and nearly drown in the process, and of course, because of oxygen deprivation while they're diving around into these supposed underwater caverns, before they come ashore. Obviously, the other people in the tribe are watching from the trees to pull them out, make sure they don't actually drown and die. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a very high survivorship rate. And under oxygen deprivation, they get various visions and then see their animal totem, or just choose their animal totem because they didn't actually see anything spiritual, I'm sure, in some cases. As far as the concept of ancestral closeness goes, if you read Rudolf Steiner's work on the occult significance of blood, I'm planning to redo that manuscript and release it. The one that I've got on Amazon isn't available because of some confusion involving copyright. It's not in copyright. The original work is far too old to be. It had to do with, I think, a certain English translation of it that gets conflated with the original text, so I'm not exactly sure, so I'll have to redo that at some point. If you read that, the basic theory in sort of the Victorian Edwardian period, sort of the early 1900s, the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, is that there are two distinct sort of groups of humans upon the earth throughout time. The first human has a completely tribal memory. That is because, Steiner says it's because of the homogeneous nature of the blood. We would call it the genetic pool today. That a tribe that has not had contact with other groups of people, that has been completely divergent for a long period, it shares a tribal type of memory that goes beyond what we see as memory today. That is, that some of these more primitive groups recount past events that don't involve them as a physical self, as though they themselves were part of it. That is, they identify through the ancestors in a physical sense. The concept of being, the mental concept of being apart from the ancestral lineage doesn't exist. And so they have a sort of tribal memory, past events, they recount them as though they were actually physically there or had physically witnessed them, even if they take place centuries before. When man begins, in Steiner's opinion, of course, this is informed by the eugenics movement, sort of the anthropic movements of the time, the theosophists and so forth. The pure theosophists under Steiner, not the latter-day sort of split-off movements. Anthroposophy, you could call it. Under his opinion, it's when this mixing begins, these different groups sort of mingle together, the tribal memory is lost, and the individualistic system begins. That is, the human race gains the ability to look at themselves as apart from things and cognate on a higher level intellectually, but loses the tribal memory because now the ancestral lineage is broken by blood. Conspiracy theorists would say this is why the Nazis were involved with what they did as far as trying to bring back tribal, sort of Volkish pagan ways, trying to maintain purity of blood where it was possible to make it exist, because they were trying to revive this ancestral memory. The idea was to create a master race by mixing modern man with his higher cognition with the tribal memory, to try to revive that concept, at least if you listen to certain theories within sort of the Nazi occultism, Hitler occultism, whatever occultism of the Cold War that you get sort of retrospectively applied to the Nazi era. But going further than this, I think it goes quite a bit beyond this. If you believe in other planes of existence, one could say that the ancestral lineage is technically a part of you. Not on the physical plane here, but in these various other planes, it's acting upon you constantly. Most people simply do not perceive of it because they have no interest in such material, they have no interest in such ideas. They lack the mental capability to commune with their ancestors or draw inspiration from them. One might say that oftentimes, if you look at the original Greek term, daimon, rather than the sort of modern Abrahamized term, demon, if you look at the original term, often what is being remarked upon is one of two things, and I think we could look at them as being together in this case. One would be an ancestral spirit, literally a departed ancestor. They're angry for some reason, they're trying to help a person for some reason. You get it in the context of these sort of epic texts where someone is going to Tartarus or whatever to talk with their dead ancestor by leaving gifts for Hades or something like that. The other is the inspiring spirit, the daimon referred to in the divine Pymander in the Hermetic texts of the Renaissance, some of these other texts. And if you combine the two, then basically you're getting what I'm talking about. You're getting an inspiration, subconscious or something you can actually see and which is more tangible. Now, from an ancestral lineage for some purpose. Some people feel a great closeness to their ancestors, and some people feel no closeness at all. A lot of times, excuse me, man in his modern materialistic condition looks at the dead as being, well, the physical body's gone, it's just a skeleton buried in the ground now, there's nothing left of this person. This is a foreign concept to some people in the world today. It would be a foreign concept to most people that have ever existed on the face of the earth. This is a very modern concept. In fact, the idea that the dead in some form or fashion aren't interfering with the world of the living, you're basically looking at less than the last century. You're looking at basically the post-Edwardian era. Even back in the Victorian days, you're getting all of these seances and so forth. They're very fashionable. People are trying to communicate with the dead. Before that, you have the latter-day grimoire cycles going on, sort of the mid-1800s through the antebellum and Civil War period. These things are still being made and printed at that time. You'd get the Black Pullet or one of the latter-day works. And they went beyond, and I've said this before, I think most people think occultism is like really underground and obscure, and most people have no belief in such things, and most people don't regard it at all. We've just been taking an almost 100-year-long break from occultism being rather mainstream. The concept that these forces, which we now call superstition, do not act upon the world is relatively a new concept, and it's being abandoned right now. We've seen for several years now, people have said, oh, the decline of religion in the Western world, the decline of Christianity, the decline of whatever religion, Catholicism's dying, mainline Protestant religion is in decline. Yeah, that's true. Those are the same groups that actually attempted to do away with the sort of paganistic superstition because they felt it was a threat. People were finding more interest in these other works than they were in the Bible, and that's why they attempted to suppress them. Even the enlightened so-called atheists of the age delved into the occult. They simply looked at it as philosophical materials, early science, as opposed to witchy voodoo material. A lot of the stuff that you get today is the witchy voodoo side of nonsense. It has no power. It doesn't even have a purpose. It's not occultism. It's not even really folk magic. It's not even necessarily based upon a real magical tradition. You would get any of a million different interchangeable little manuscripts that are circulated talking about money and love spells and stuff like that. None of them are real. Where you've got any reality at all, it's some folk magic practice that usually has been changed, oftentimes owing its own existence to far older occult works that in turn were transformed over time. With the ancestors, though, it's a pure concept. It's basically, at its core, essentially, it's simply regarding the ancestral lineage as being of some spiritual significance. Even people who don't, think about ghosts and things like that, you would get the image of the sort of modern person. Mother dies, father dies, grandparent dies, sibling dies, or whatever. And they would remark to one another, "Oh, well, don't worry, they're still watching you, watching over you, looking at you from the sky," or whatever. Well, where does this concept come from? They remark upon these things in passing and don't really give them importance. They just sort of say it offhand out of habit. But where does the concept actually come from? It comes from the concept of the ancestors actually physically, literally being there in some form. From some ethereal plane, looking down from heaven, looking up from hell, depending on what they did with their lives, or in a totemic manner, literally, the veneration of these ancestors. In some cases, you have tribes and groups of people in the past, in some parts of the world in the present, that take the bones of their ancestors or the corpses or something and they dress them up and perform rituals with them, or they store them in some special little place or on a special little altar to communicate with them. You get the concept of the Day of the Dead. I can't remember the name of the tribe. I think they're in New Guinea, that they literally like mummify all of their corpses and they make little houses for them up in the rock cliffs and they put the corpses up there to look down. They take them down every year and like wash them and redress them and dance around with them and stuff. And a lot of people in modernity would look at this practice and say, well, that's pretty weird because bodies, they're meant to go in the ground and rot and turn into skeletons, or we just burn them to ashes. Again, that's a foreign concept. Most people throughout history, especially with cremation, would look at that concept, at that practice, and they would call it an abomination. They would think it was a horrendous idea. The Indians, the people of India, they've cremated remains for a long time. They wouldn't necessarily have a problem with it. The Zoroastrians leave the bodies out in the open on rocks in some of their like temple areas and let vultures come down and eat them. The idea is the body's ascending through the heavens sort of by these psychopomp sort of birds that are feasting upon the flesh. But for many groups around time, even something like cremation or the Christian idea of the burial as it generally takes place, literally lowering the body to rot in the ground in a box, would be considered an abomination. The Islamist practices would be the same. Why do you think that so often, when one culture displaces another, what's one of the first things that they typically go for? They go for the graves. They go for the tombs and the mausoleums and stuff. We had an attack several years ago in Mali where tombs dating back to late antiquity from some of the pagans there, some of the pagan nobles from the tribes there that existed, were attacked by, I believe it was Boko Haram, although it might have been Al-Shabaab or one of these other groups. They ripped these tombs open, they desecrated the remains, bombed the tombs, defaced them in various ways. Why do you think they did that? Because they're trying to break the sort of ancestral spirit of the people there to subdue them to a new belief system that these other groups, the jihadists, They feel that the group isn't practicing authentic Islam because they're still, in a way, venerating these ruins. And they have a thing for any pagan ruins, but it appears burials and temples especially, above all else. They go for the graves and they go for the tombs to try to destroy them, to break the ancestral lineage of a people. Because the idea is that those people might eventually liberate themselves from your ideology if they ever return to that sort of tribal pagan mentality. You see this time and time again. There's no respect for the dead. Even modern archaeology can be guilty of this. Personally, it's my belief that when a burial is found, it should be left alone. It can be studied on site. It's perfectly acceptable to open up and study it and document what you find, but it should be left alone. They shouldn't be taking mummies and dragging them out of their tombs and putting them in museums, because clearly, if we look at the people from thousands of years ago as sentient and intelligent and rational and capable of making decisions, which they had to have been to have built the megaliths that they did and the tombs that they did with such precision, clearly it was their desire for their body to be left there. They may have given their spirit more importance than the body, but it should be left alone. The veneration of ancestral remains. The physical remains, the actual skeleton or mummy or whatever, the burial stuff that they were placed with, that goes along with the spiritual concept, which is, of course, veneration in a mental sense or in a purely spiritual sense. I think this gets overlooked because, again, one could even see much modern physical science in such a sense as materialistic. That is, they dig up a mummy, they're not really, they're not, gonna carve the mummy into pieces like they did in the Victorian era and burn it as firewood or something. They destroyed hundreds of thousands of mummies, by the way, in that process. They used to grind them up for medicine. They used to burn them as fuel. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff. They used to ingest mummy powder for impotence and for rheumatism and all sorts of problems. They used to think it was medicinal, even though it's basically cardboard once it's several thousand years old. Cardboard with a little bit of resin in it, a little bit of human flesh still tattered and tangled with the linens or so forth. They used to grind it up and eat it, which is kind of a little bit morbid. But then again, mellified man is worse. You should look that up. Look up mellified man, MELLIFIED. Man, and then you'll see an Arabic process that's 10 times more morbid than eating mummy powder or sprinkling it on your dick or shoving it up your ass or whatever they used to do in the Victorian era to these poor mummies. But yes, the veneration of the physical aspect of the ancestors goes hand in hand with the spiritual aspect. Some people are receptive to the idea, the general notion, if not anything in specific, that their ancestors have a presence here. Some people go further, and then you get the charlatans who say, well, I can talk to your dead relative for a fee. Or I can talk to your dead relative if you'll sign a waiver and participate on my show so that millions of other people will watch ads and I'll get paid anyway. That's essentially how it works. That sort of stuff, again, is materialism. It's not occultism. It's not a spiritual practice. It's the bastardization of a spiritual practice and its incorporation into the materialistic modern culture. I won't say like, oh, well, capitalism is destroying the spiritual. No, not necessarily. In many cases, it enhances it. It gives people a reason to delve into occult study, release literature, make occult instruments and so forth of good enough quality to be used. That's just fine. But when you take the very spiritual concept at the core of the ancestral lineage, the concept that the spirit is capable of communicating or exists in some form, whether it's a soul, a disembodied spirit on some other plane, another plane of existence entirely that's sort of overlapped with this one or whatever, when you take the central concept and capitalize on that, usually in a charade, yes, that would be the bastardization of spirituality. So those are some of my thoughts on ancestral spirits. A little bit of a rant here. I know I don't go too deep into the concept, I guess. My own thoughts about it. I believe that there's a connection between the lineage of an individual and their existence, their physical existence. What that specific link is, I think, defies explanation. And one thing that I want to be clear about with many of the things within the occult that I talk about, I don't have a Gnostic style knowledge of exactly how all of these processes work. The fact that I may believe in some of them is evidence that I have either seen it work or I have theorized that it is probably capable of working. How it specifically works, though, isn't necessarily something I can accurately explain. There's a difference between someone who will tell you, well, I know where you go when you die. I know what happens when you practice this ritual. I know where your ancestors are. No, you don't. Generally speaking, you can't know. That's one of the fun things about life is there's not necessarily an answer, there's more of a search. Once you've found all the answers and the search is over, you get bored. It's like when you're the best at something and no one can possibly challenge you, you're going to be bored for the rest of eternity. It's much better to lose your memory of any past lives you have lived and just keep cycling through each time seeing things a little bit differently. Personally, I think that's the definition of paradise. I think the concept of heaven sounds quite sad, actually. A place filled with melancholy, the way that the Catholics, with Dante's imagery, might regard sort of the purgatorial aspect of the Inferno, or certainly the city of Minos, as being a place surrounded by a little bit of sadness. Even there's no suffering or anything like that, but these people are doomed to never see God. I would apply that to the paradise that many of the Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe in, because it's just a place that never changes. There's nothing new and exciting to actually do there other than sit there, I guess, and eat leaves off the tree of life and look at the pretty amethyst walls and pearly gates. That's basically all you end up doing. Sounds rather sad and boring to me. That's about all. Peace out.